Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jon Wisman. He's a professor of economics at American University in Washington, D.C., and he is the author of the book we're going to talk about today, The Origins and Dynamics of Inequality, Sex, Politics, and Ideology. So, Dr. Wisman, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Ricardo. I appreciate that you've invited me to join you.
So let me ask you perhaps one basic question to start off with. What kinds of inequality do you focus on in the book? Because it could be several kinds, and particularly since you base your approach on biology or evolutionary biology, to be more specific, it could be economic inequality, sexual inequality, a relationship between the two. So, what's your take there?
Well, my book is focused upon all forms of inequality, absolutely all. And inequality is a consequence of the fact that humans are biologically condemned to be competitive. And because they're competitive, we wind up with all sorts of inequalities. Some compete more successfully than others, creating various forms of or expressions of inequality. So after the first three chapters of the book, I turn to two forms of competition, the economic and the political. And I examine inequality in these two domains. So the first three chapters sort of set the stage in terms of setting out the biological origins of inequality. And then the rest of the book, after chapter 3, focuses on what has occurred since the beginning of the state, the rise of the state, and civilization, when competition came to be expressed predominantly in terms of seeking wealth and political power. And that remains true today.
So, over the years, the centuries, even there have been several different takes on inequality, particularly from economists, also philosophers, and others. How would you say your approach in the book differs from the other main ones out there?
Yes, good question. The inequality has become such a focus of interest, both by researchers, the public, and politicians, so that it's generated a kind of inequality intellectual industry in which there is a huge production of books and articles concerning inequality, why it exists, how it manifests itself, et cetera, et cetera. And I have found these essentially not fully adequate, and my book is an attempt to provide what has been left out of the discourse. And that is predominantly four things. The first is that inequality, or the struggle over inequality, is the driving force of all human history, right back to the beginning of our species. And that has three supporting claims. The first claim is that the reason inequality exists is rooted in our biology, the fact that we sexually compete. And we compete for status, and those with the highest status come to be seen as the best mates. That is, those mates who will promise the greatest possible success for your offspring, your children. Now, this isn't just with humans, this is with absolutely all mating species of animals. The second claim is that inequality is political. That is, we continually identify things like globalization, technological change, etc., as that which is generating our inequality, and that's not wrong. Those are not wrong, but they are proximate causes. Beneath them lies politics, because politics sets the rules of the game. Politics can always neutralize economic forces. So the second pillar then is politics. The third pillar that is supporting claim is what has really been ignored most in social science and history, and that is the role of ideology. Ideology I define as the use of doctrines to justify exploitation, the use of doctrines to persuade the less fortunate, those that are getting the short end of the stick, that the system is fair, even though it is giving an elite the overwhelming amount of wealth, income, and privileges. That basically is the structure of my argument.
In what ways does it differ from accounts put forth by great scholars in our human history like Karl Marx and more recently Thomas Piketty?
Well, it shares a lot with Marx, and that Marx also identified inequality as the most important central issue. He argued that it's the monopoly ownership of the means of production that is the foundation for inequality. But we differ in very substantial ways. And most importantly, he also, by the way, he gives importance to ideology. In fact, the interpretation of ideology that I use is the one that was identified by Marx. Marx is generally thought to be the father of ideology, that is, the study of how doctrines serve to legitimate inequality and exploitation. But Marx held a number of views which I don't accept, and most particularly, and I suspect we will discuss these a bit more later on in the interview, most importantly, he rejected private property and markets as themselves causes of inequality and exploitation. I argue, by contrast, no, they are instruments that the elite uses to carry out exploitation, but per se, in and of themselves, they are important for economic dynamism and freedom. Oh, and then Piketty.
Yeah.
Piketty he is a marvel. He is just such an incredible intellectual. And what he has done, he's done more than anyone else in modern times to bring about a deeper understanding of inequality. And he's brought forth a wealth of statistics to demonstrate the extent of inequality in the world. And his contribution is just invaluable. But he doesn't address the same sorts of questions that I do. He doesn't go to why is it that we're competitive, for instance. And he doesn't, although he gives importance to ideology, and it's actually in the title of one of his works, he doesn't view ideology as Marx did and as I do, and that is as an instrument of exploitation. He uses ideology pretty much as ideology has come to be used, as just whatever you believe. You have your ideologies, I have my ideologies, and ideology has just been hollowed out of any real meaning. So I'm trying to go back to a definition or an understanding of ideology which has a clear-cut definition. Now, Piketty and I see us as complementary, not competitive. There's very little he does. There are some things that I take issue with in the book, but they're relatively minor. Basically, I think, as I said, I'm not offering a substitute for his analysis as much as adding things that he hasn't addressed, at least to my mind, adequately.
So let's look deep into the origins of the issue here, inequality. So what are the bases of inequality from an evolutionary perspective?
Yes. Darwin held to and set forth the idea of fitness, that is, species evolve competitively or with competition within the species and with other species as well for survival. And he came forth with the argument that the fittest, that is, those that best fit their environments, that can best exploit their unique environments, carry the, we now say genes, I will simply add to his, the genes that are then passed on into the future. He didn't use genes, but he had exactly the same concept. So, but he came up against a problem, and that is, how do you explain the huge tail of a peacock, which is heavy, takes enormous resources to nourish, it slows down flight, it makes the poor peacock, male, and the peacock is male, vulnerable, more vulnerable to predators, more vulnerable to being some other animal's lunch. And then another classic example is that of the stag. The stag with the huge rack of antlers. What kind of sense can that make? It certainly doesn't improve fitness because that too is heavy, requires enormous resources, can slow down flight from predators, get caught in the brush in attempts to escape them, and they fall off every year. So how do we explain all of that? And Darwin came up with a second principle of selection, natural selection, and that is sexual selection. Those unfit characteristics found predominantly in the male exist because they are chosen by the females. The females choose this stag with the enormous rack and the peacock with the most gorgeous, largest tail, because they must be fit to carry that handicap. They must really be fit. So they are then preferentially chosen for mating. And those genes then get passed, carrying those traits, get passed into the future. And what's really interesting about this is that it's the females of the species then that are guiding the evolution of male morphology. And even more than that, male behavior. So essentially, because males compete for females to mate, and females compete amongst themselves for the highest quality males, then humans are necessarily going to be unequal in the size of not just humans, but all animals in terms of their racks, in terms of the peacock's tail, and in terms of practically everything else having to do with physical traits and behavior. Now, amongst humans, physical traits are important. How handsome you are, how strong you are, how well proportioned you are, but far more important amongst humans, at least after puberty. When kids are teenagers, of course, the most important thing is looks, but they soon grow to understand that there are more sophisticated characteristics that are cultural. And those cultural traits, of course, in earliest societies were things like being a great warrior, protecting the society, being a great hunter, helping nourish the society, being a great gatherer, nourishing the society, being someone who contributes a lot to the community, helping making the community more thriving in various ways that it must be to be competitive with other societies, by being kind, by being generous, by being artistic, by being smart, by telling great stories, by being fun to be with. All of these things count in your status, and high status people are more attractive to the opposite sex because it believes that their higher status indicates superior genes, which will enhance the possibility that offspring will survive, thrive, and send their genes into the future. So through sexual selection, those traits that provide status are then sent into the future genetically, and therefore they are selected to be more prominent within the species. That is why inequality exists, because all of these things are inequality in various ways. You're more generous than I am. You're kinder than I am. You're more charming than I am. You're a better hunter, etc., etc. Now, what was the case for 97, 98% of Homo sapiens history, that is our species, is that we lived as hunter-gatherers. We were foragers. We lived like all other animals. We had to go out and find our food. And that's what we did. Now, that's almost all of our history. We are genetically almost the same as we were when we left foraging for agriculture. That's only 10,000 years ago. And the genetic changes in the past 10,000 years, well, it's not long enough a period of time for really substantial genetic change to occur. Some has occurred. For instance, the most notable one is lactose tolerance amongst herding peoples, that's pastoral peoples, that could better survive if they could drink the milk of their herd animals. That is a notable example, but otherwise, evolutionary biologists don't believe there has been a great deal of change. So we are then foragers. And let me just say one other thing to help people better understand what that means. Foragers must organize themselves, if they're social species, as humans are, so as to hunt and gather food in an optimal way. Now, until very recently, until about 50 years ago, it was widely believed that they just had to always be doing this, and that their lives must have been miserable, always trying to find enough to eat. But more recent anthropology has found that no, that's not true. In fact, they worked only between approximately 12 and 20 hours a week. And the rest of the time, they goofed off. They did other things. They flirted, they sang, they danced, they slept, they did whatever it was pleasant to do in the time that they didn't have to be out fetching food. Now, this 12 to 18 or 19 or 20 hours is found even amongst people living in the most remote parts, the most inhospitable parts of the earth, like the Kalahari Desert or the Inuits in the Arctic. These people, in spite of their environments, harsh environments, still didn't work that much. That always reminds me, and I always share with my student the analogy with all the birds I see sitting out in the trees and hanging around on the power lines. They obviously are goofing off. They're not spending their time out trying to find food. They don't have to. That is, in only a portion of their time, awake time, is needed. Only a portion of that is needed for their sustenance.
Let's get into a specific aspect of human mating then. Talking about mating systems, there's things like polygamy, it could be polygyny or polyandry, and monogamy. Is there a relationship between a mating system and inequality?
Yes, very definitely so. We don't know deeply, fully, what gender relationships were like in that long period of hunter and gathering society. But most evidence suggests that men and women lived in relative equality, that there wasn't a great deal of inequality, although there was a division of labor. That is, men typically did the hunting and women didn't. And the reason women didn't do the hunting is that they had to nurse young children. And to be nursing and be on the hunt, of course, would not be a good mix for success. So females, women, typically did more gathering. But other than this division of labor, it's believed that they lived in basic equality. Remember, amongst hunter-gatherers, by and large, with some exceptions, which we'll perhaps discuss later, they lived in economic and political equality. That is, there were not material differences between people. They all lived at the same level of material well-being. They shared everything. They shared everything because it made sense given their mode of production, because you are lucky as a hunter today, but you might not be for the next week or something. So if everybody shares, then you have insurance against not being so lucky for a period of time. So sharing simply made economic sense. It also made sense with meat for another reason, and other gathered foods, and that is, if you didn't eat them pretty quickly, they would either rot or scavengers would come in and clean it out. So sharing simply made sense, and therefore there was greater equality. Also, we should add to that that it was not very possible to accumulate much in the way of material wealth when you're nomadic, when you're always on the move to new hunting and gathering grounds. So their whole mode of existence worked against inequality. It's not that they wouldn't be unequal in terms of wealth and politics if it worked for them, but it didn't work for them. Inequality and wealth and politics only comes with the rise of the state, and that's only approximately 5,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Because the two sexes tend to have different reproductive strategies, would that imply that inequality is mostly a male game?
No, I don't think so. They do have different strategies, and let's say a few words about that.
Mm-hmm.
A female can only have a limited number of children. And that, of course, is biologically determined. She has a certain fertile period, and during that period, she can have X number of children, but it's still very limited. But for a male, there is a limit, of course, but it's huge. That is, they can father as many children as they can inseminate fertile women. And that makes them, of course, different from women in terms of their strategy. Their strategy, and everybody knows that men tend to be more promiscuous than women, and they tend, and women tend to be more interested in stability that will give their children the best chance of survival. Now, it doesn't seem that in early society this made a great deal of difference in terms of their equality. But it had to do with their behavior, and it had to do with the politics between them, how they worked out things so as to be able to care for each other and reproduce our species. But it apparently was not extreme. What happens that turns it in extreme is the rise of the state and the rise of private property and the rise of huge inequality in wealth and political power. And with that increase in wealth, men do exactly what their biology tells them to do. That is, wealthy, powerful men And that is they try to inseminate as many women as they can. And they imprison women to do so in harems, and where they have exclusive right of sex with these women. And the number in the harem can be huge. It's, for those that know or abide by Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, well, you have the story of King Solomon. King Solomon had 1,000 women in his harem. And that is not exceptional. Well, maybe 1,000 is, but harems existed throughout the civilized world until relatively modern times in all extremely unequal societies. It was to the great disadvantage of poor men, because essentially wealthy, powerful men monopolized sexual access, or sexually access to females. And those without resources then wound up without mating. This only, of course, sent genes into the future that would privilege the behavior that created this inequality.
Mm-hmm. So just touching on one of the issues, one of the things you mentioned in my previous question. So there seems to be recent data put forth by people like Dr. Manvir Singh that point to the fact that perhaps, at least in the late Pleistocene, some hunter-gatherer societies or forager societies were a little bit more unequal than people or anthropologists in general tended to think up until recently. Would that bring any issues to your approach on the book or in the book or not?
No, none whatsoever, in fact. It's long been known amongst anthropologists and archaeologists that there were certain peoples, hunter-gatherers, that amongst whom there was great inequality. And these were typically societies that lived on food-rich waterways. That is, they were on water, which was filled with seafood, fish, shellfish, etc., and they didn't have to then be nomadic to supply themselves with what they needed. They became sedentary, and they could then accumulate property because they were sedentary. They didn't have to carry it with them. And some of these became extremely unequal. Some even had slavery. But it was thought that the percentage of total hunter-gatherer societies that were unequal because they lived in sedentary conditions was very, very limited. New research, such as that which you have cited, finds that, well, maybe there was a whole lot more than we previously believed. But this doesn't change the fundamental argument. There's still the same competition, and it will simply manifest itself in terms of the rules of the game. What I mean by that is that every society sets rules, or in more formal societies, laws. They have moral precepts. They have rules of the game by which you must abide. That is, you can compete with others as long as it is within those set rules, but not outside of them, or you will face penalties, be punished, or something of that sort. I think that the appeal to games as an example, sports rather, is really helpful here. Think about a game. We create a game. Basketball, football, tennis, doesn't matter. In every game we create, oh, by the way, we create societies too, although maybe not as in such a planned way, but we do create our societies. So we create a game. We set strict rules as to what the players can do in their competition that is appropriate. If they violate those rules, they face penalties, and the penalties can cost them points, which caused them to lose. So sports then, sports games, are a marvelous mirror of exactly what we're talking about. Society does exactly the same thing, and if you behave within those rules, then everything is fine. But the rules change. Societies set rules differently. In the primitive hunter-gatherer societies, the rules were set such that if you attempted to gather wealth for yourself or political power, you were dissuaded, and if you persisted, punished. And anthropologists have argued, even by death. That is, if you insisted on superiority to others in these domains, you could be taken out into the brush and shot with arrows. So society strictly maintains its rules. And the rules they set are the rules they think are fair. So everyone has to behave fairly. So back to sports again. If you don't obey the rules, you are unfair in your competition and you're penalized. So too in society. But now the kicker. What is fair is socially defined. It's been found that and we all know this, have a deep sense of fairness. It's found in all humans, and it's found even in other primates, and some recent studies have found it among some dogs. So fairness is very, very important. It is a break on, a control of inequality, the sense of fairness. So it's okay, you can compete as long as you do so fairly according to the rules of the game. But I said fairness, what is fair is socially determined, and those with the greatest influence over society, those that are wealthy and politically powerful, have disproportionate power in determining what is fair. So we get in unequal societies, we get the ideology that what is in the benefit, those institutions which benefit disproportionately the rich, the elite, are fair. And they're best for everyone. And insofar as others are persuaded by this ideology, everything is fine for the elite. Ideology is persuading others that social institutions which exploit them and leave them with the short end of the stick are fair. That is what ideology is. It hoodwinks the losers into believing everything's fair.
Mm-hmm. Later in the interview, we will come back to this topic of ideology and break it down a little bit further. But before that, let's now head into the agricultural states. So what changed with the advent of these states, and what mechanisms really allowed for the elites to keep power even with rising levels of inequality?
Agriculture, as we mentioned a few moments ago, was only adopted about 10,000 years ago. And there are various reasons which we won't go deeply into here as to why humans adopted agriculture when they did. But the most prominent explanations are that the Ice Age changed the environment, and population growth made it so that it was no longer as attractive to gather your food, hunt your food, and survive, and cultivating food became more attractive as an option. With agriculture, you become sedentary, at least most forms, not with pasturage, where you're herding animals, but cultivating the land makes you sedentary. And once you get sedentary societies, you get population density, greater population growth and density. And with that, you have a greater need for social coordination. It can't be determined as fluidly as it was in hunter-gatherer societies. It becomes more formal. And what apparently arose were chiefdoms, that is, chiefs, that argued that they had a special relationship with the gods, with the celestial forces, with that gave them the power to better protect their society's interest, that their harvest would be better, the rains would come, that the locust wouldn't come, etc., etc. And that with the special power they had, they merited certain privileges. And the privilege that they most exploited, of course, was having more wives. This is the mandate that Darwin points out, the mandate of our biology to send your genes into the future. So now we're getting inequality and the ability to do that. But these societies, early agricultural societies, pre-state societies, they were fragile. That is, the hierarchy was fragile. First, it should be noted that they didn't typically gather a lot of wealth for themselves. They took a little bit more, but often they took it to give it back in feast. That is, to prove their power and their beneficence. So this potlatch sort of thing, this tradition of the big man tradition, where you try to put on a big feast to impress other people and to please them, of course, and to be to their benefit. But what you're really seeking is high status, which will, in Darwin's terms, lead to more success in sending your unique genes into the future. So anthropologists such as Kent Flannery and Joyce Marcus, in their wonderful book, The Creation of Inequality, which is a study of the earliest forms of inequality, such as the one we're discussing here, they suggest that these societies typically cycled from limited equality back to limited inequality back to equality. And what crashed the hierarchy was that when the harvests were bad, when the locust infestation destroyed their crops, or some climatic thing did, well, where is their special relationship with the gods if these catastrophes could befall them? So it essentially exposed the falsity of the chief's claims. Now, that doesn't mean the chief didn't actually come to believe them. The elite, those with privilege, tend to come to believe their own ideology and become victims of it. So we don't get sustainable inequality until we get the state. And I need to say something about that. The reason the chief couldn't maintain authority and privilege when the legitimacy of his power was undermined is because he didn't have the military force to do so. He didn't have the advantage over everybody else of special weaponry or military organization. Now, when we go back to hunter-gatherers, and we're still in the Stone Age with the early agriculturalists, stone tools could be used as stone weapons. And stones are abundant. They're not scarce. So anyone could wind up carrying weapons, and most people did. These males did. And that acted to keep inequality from rising. There was another force keeping inequality from rising. Because if somebody became a bully and tried to take more, you could simply end their lives with your Stone Age tools. Either hit them on the head with a big rock, or throw a spear through them, or hit them with a heavy ox bone, or whatever. But the tools were democratically possessed. It takes the state to get to a big differential in the quality and power of weapons. And that's the rise of the state.
Before we go into other parts of our history, more recent ones, let me ask you about legitimation theory and the role of religion. So, first of all, what is legitimation theory and how does it apply for us to have a better understanding of what ideology is and how it works?
Mhm, mhm. The most wonderful study was published a very long time ago, in 1965, by Thomas Luckman and, um, and Peter Berger. It's called The Social Legitimation of Reality. And this beautiful study essentially begins with the fact that there's instinct poverty amongst humans. That is, our instincts don't instruct us as to all we have to do. We must fill it in. And when we fill it in, we give meaning to our existence. We define our existence in various ways. This is a necessity. We legitimate our society. Ideology is a special category of legitimation in which inequality is legitimated, in which inequality is made to seem, as I said before, fair. And from the very beginning of human history, religion has served two basic functions. Religion helps us deal with the fact that we suffer and that we must die. Two existential horrors that we must come to terms with, or we struggle to come to terms with. Religion provides us with some meaning for that, some solace against these existential horrors. The second function of religion is that it reduces what we economists call free rider problems. And by that, I'll use this example. All societies have something equivalent to the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments define things we mustn't do if we're going to have a social order that is not chaos and violent, where we can live together. And these Ten Commandments, if we believe the religion, and we believe, perhaps say, if we violate these commandments, we will spend eternity in hell or something like that, or we'll come back as some lesser species, or whatever the punishment might be. If we really believe that, then we will behave. And if we behave, we don't need to spend as many of our resources maintaining public order. We don't have to have a lot of policemen running around, for instance. Social peace will come cheaper. And religion then provides a reduction in these social disorders by getting people to behave out of respect for gods or out of fear of them, one or the other. Now, these two functions always existed and still exist. But a third function was added with the rise of the state, civilization, and extreme inequality. And that third function was legitimating, providing ideology, justifying inequality. And that manifests itself in many ways, but most of them share a lot in common. For instance, a perfect God or perfect gods would create a perfect universe. Of course. How could a perfect God or gods do anything but that? They wouldn't be perfect if their creation was not perfect. Well, if it's perfect, then just the way it is just. It's fair. It must be this way. So it says that everything about it, including its extreme inequality, is the way the gods wish it, the way cosmologically it must be. This is perfect. The most extreme form of this that I have encountered is Hinduism. Hinduism argues that your station in life, your caste, is the result of your karma, that is your behavior, in an earlier life or earlier lives. So you have this life you have, no matter what it is, you're elite or you're an untouchable, you're living in extreme misery. Well, that is your fault. That is due to your behavior in your earlier lives. Now, if you want your next life, your next reincarnation to be better, then you had better do what you're supposed to do according to the rules of your caste. So don't rock the boat. Just simply do what you're supposed to do to fulfill your duties as a member of this caste. And if you do it really well, you'll come back better off. And if you continue to do it better and better, be more obedient, etc., you will eventually arise to perfection. Now, what's the marvelous little kicker on this is that don't be unhappy about your sorry state. It's temporary. It's only one life, and all of the reincarnated lives you're going to have on your way to perfection. So it's no big deal. You'll turn out fine in the end if you are good. Now, notice the same thing happens in non-reincarnation religions too. If you really are good, say in Christian society, if you're really good, then you will go to heaven. And if you're not, hell is your final destination. Well, same sort of thing, but now not without the same dynamic as reincarnation. It's been suggested, and I agree from what I know, that Hinduism is the perfect legitimation of privilege. It's hard to imagine dreaming up anything that would work better than that. Of course, like most religions, because they see the static present as the ideal, they work against economic dynamism and progress. Because if what exists is already perfect, then don't change it. New technology can be opposed.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about the early agricultural states moving forward. Was there something special about European feudalism when it comes to the history of inequality?
I think only in helping set the stage for what comes next. European feudalism shares with agrarian unequal societies a great deal. This is nothing that is super unique about, in this respect, about European feudalism. After the fall of the Roman Empire, for about 500 years or so, there were no real states that could protect property, that could protect people. And people then wound up living in villages, dispersed villages, over a very lowly populated geography, Europe. And they typically had the same weapons to defend themselves as the bandits held. So they could gather together in their villages and defend themselves against raiders, against those that would subjugate them, that would exploit them. But as population density increased, and as increasingly a warrior elite could afford horses and could arm themselves because they have stirrups which will hold them in their saddles firmly, they could become armored and they could wreak havoc on these villagers. They had superior technology in the form of horses and stirrups and armor, helmets, and of course, weaponry. And they were able to subjugate these peoples And that is the beginning of European feudalism. So the warrior elites, with a leader becoming the lord of the manor, then they exploit these peasant farmers. They leave the peasant farmers, or serfs rather, with just enough to survive. They take the remainder for their luxury and for their defense, because they are ever on the edge, if not in war, with their neighboring manors. So warfare is characteristic of European feudalism. But population density increases, and as it does, it creates more space for trade. It creates more possibility of goods being exchanged, many coming from afar, that can get safe enough passage because there's more dense population to offer protection, so that markets expand. And it's the expansion of these markets which will generate a capitalist class, a bourgeoisie, that will give us nascent capitalism. So feudalism, in a sense, then, is setting the stage for capitalism. And let me say something about why capitalism survives in Europe. In a wonderful little book called The Invisible Hand by Bas van Bevel, Bas van Bevel finds that capitalist institutions, capitalism, did exist in very limited ways in Iraq at one time, and then later in Italy, and then later in the Netherlands. But in all of these cases, the dynamic was that the capitalists, who were dynamic innovators, investing in more productive trade and manufacturing, that they, once they got enough wealth to have political influence, used that political influence to rewrite the rules of the game so they could take ever more income as rent. That is, it became what economists call rent seekers. They took increasing amounts of income, and invested in speculative ventures and in conspicuous consumption. Once again, competing for the highest status, the pinnacle of status amongst themselves, but doing so in huge estates, in statuary, and all other forms of conspicuous consumption. And in doing so, then investment declined, and they destroyed the very foundation of their wealth and privilege, and capitalism faded away in these three instances. But what happens in Europe is that European states, as they arise at the end, begin to arise at the end of feudalism, European states are in competition with other European states in warfare. There's constant warfare between European states. And no one state is very successful in conquering its neighbors. And that's thanks to the marvelous geography of Europe. Think about Europe's geography. You've got the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, Spain today, which is a peninsula surrounded by water. It's difficult to attack people by water. And then you've got these formidable mountains, the Pyrenees, which are very difficult to take an army across. So the peoples of the Hispanic Peninsula are relatively protected from conquest from abroad. Italy, exactly the same thing, surrounded by water, but in this case, the Alps, formidable barriers to invasion. The Scandinavian countries, peninsulae, and so forth. The Netherlands, much of it is marshland. It's hard to march an army through marshland. So you get Oh, don't forget England, of course, surrounded entirely by water. And that gave such incredible protection that England wasn't really successfully invaded over more than 1,000 years. That is 1066, the Norman invasion, because it had this natural protection. So what this meant was that if one country suppressed technology, for instance, then the neighboring state that adopts the technology that makes their industry more proficient becomes militarily more powerful. And if you don't adopt that same technology, you're going to be at the mercy of their greater strength, their greater military strength. So this competition manifests itself in all sorts of ways. Interestingly, for intellectual advances. For instance, if in most countries, if you express some heretical kinds of thoughts, they punish you, they kill you, and burn you at the stake or whatever. But in Europe, if you try to persecute some free thinker, that free thinker would pack bags and move to another state where they could get refuge. And this happened over and over again. Descartes, Voltaire, Karl Marx, etc., etc. Those whose ideas the state tried to repress, but they couldn't do so. Come back to technology, just because there's a very interesting case, and that's the printing press. The printing press was really opposed by states. Why? Because you could widely and cheaply produce literature critical of the state. So printing presses were prohibited. In fact, it doesn't come to the Ottoman Empire until very, very late. It doesn't come to Russia until extremely late. But in Western Europe, it was almost impossible to prohibit, because if you tried to repress or you outlawed the printing press in your country, then writers would send their manuscripts across the border to where it was legal, and then the material would be smuggled back in. So it's a good example of how you really can't stamp out technological progress, or not with such great ease. State competition meant then that if a bourgeoisie in one country began to destroy the productive capacity of that country through its conspicuous consumption, its rent seeking, and through its speculative behavior, that another country would simply pick it up. And if that country in which the bourgeoisie was destroying the economy didn't get rid of their privileges and re-alter their rules of the game, then they would simply be at the mercy of the more technologically sophisticated neighbors, who could then put forth more powerful military forces.
Earlier, when we talked about legitimation theory, we referred to the role played by religion. So now, with Reformation and the advent of Protestantism, what was brought new to the table in terms of ideology?
Now, the rise of the bourgeoisie is extremely interesting, because in traditional societies where landlords were at the top of the social order, they held the greatest prestige, the greatest power, and the greatest wealth, they forwarded the ideology that you are born to your status. We've made mention of this already, that the status you have is what fits the natural order, the natural good order, and it is what you should abide by. You shouldn't challenge it. So no one could improve themselves. No one could move their status higher. But as markets began to expand in Europe, a temptation became ever more seductive. And that is, if you participated in trade, you were a clever trader, you made good deals, you could become rich. But that would be sinful because the Catholic Church in Europe, like most traditional religions, saw profit making as sinful, saw the taking of interest on money as sinful, saw markets as corrupting, saw private property as inalienable, that is, private property, mostly in productive wealth, that is, in land, was not for sale. And it couldn't be for sale because if landlords' lands could be for sale, then they would lose their privilege. So labor was tied to the land. So labor too was not for sale. So essentially, these rising merchants faced the temptation of getting rich, but the moral disapprobation of participating in the activities that would make them rich. They suffered what is called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is where your values are conflictual with your behavior. Something has to yield. You have to either go to confession and quit the behavior, or you have to find a new set of values that will say your behavior is okay. Along comes a new expression of Protestantism, which doesn't have problems with all of the things the Catholic Church has problems with in terms of economic behavior. So making profits, that's cool. Taking interest on money, to some extent. Alienable property, just fine. Whereas markets had been seen before as simply sites of greed and corruption, now markets are efficient mechanisms which will better allocate society's resources. So what Protestantism did, because Protestantism privileged work and abstinence, that is saving, as virtues, it made virtuous what the bourgeoisie did. And the bourgeoisie wants, merchants, traders, what they want is social respectability, of course. Remember, if you don't have high status, you won't be attractive to the opposite sex. So they, like all peoples everywhere, they want social respect. They want self-respect. And Protestantism gives them a way of remaining Christian and finding virtue in their behavior. So work hard. If you work hard, as you should work hard, because working is a calling. It's God's calling to you. Everybody should work. So we get a transformation from status determined by birth to status determined by achievement. That is what you do, what you contribute. So your status now depends not on how you're born, because the bourgeoisie, the merchants, were not high born for the most part. They were low born. So your status depends on what you do. And that's a revolution in values. And that's the value, of course, which continues today in capitalist societies, and that is meritocracy. You deserve, you merit according to what you contribute to society.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to...
Just briefly, Ricardo, sorry.
Yeah.
Let me just say something briefly about abstinence.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The aristocracy spent income, its rents, its unearned income, on conspicuous consumption. That is, it's spent on things that would give it the pinnacle, or they would attempt to get the pinnacle of status for the Darwinian reasons that we've mentioned several times. Mm-hmm. So they were wasteful. They didn't contribute anything to society. They became seen increasingly as parasites. And by contrast, the hard-working merchant and then manufacturer, they were contributing to the wealth of society. And abstinence, this is exactly what the landlords weren't. That is, they spent everything they received as rent to impress others. But the bourgeoisie saved its money because the whole doctrine of Protestantism says that you should live simply. You shouldn't live through conspicuous consumption. Even the churches are simple, without a lot of ornamentation and paintings on the inside and the rest of it. Simply a meeting place to meet with your God and to pray to your God. And this abstinence, don't gamble, don't smoke, don't drink, no plays, no gambling, no anything except work hard and read the holy book. That's it. So what are you going to do with all the money you're making? You save it. And what happens to the savings? You invest it, creating ever more economic dynamism and, of course, making you ever richer. And slowly the bourgeoisie eats the aristocracy's lunch. So the aristocracy progressively loses its status and its political power. Now, there was something else about your question that slipped my mind, but let me come back to it. When the church lost its monopoly on meaning and truth, which it had retained since Roman times in Western Europe, that is, if you wanted to know the answer to any question, you went to your priest. If your priest couldn't answer it, he went higher up in the hierarchy of the church. If it were really an important question, it could go all the way to the Holy See in Rome. And there, those at the top of the religion would settle the question. With Protestantism, now, what doctrine determines truth and meaning? There's religious competition. What do you trust? What undergirds your knowledge? You have an epistemological crisis. How do we know that which we believe is true? And in this big gap that's created, so there's no one authority on truth and meaning, secular knowledge grows. Science, most prominently natural science, but also social science. And of the social sciences, it's political economy that is predominant.
Mm-hmm. So there's one aspect of the ideology coming from particularly free market capitalists where they many times tend to pit the state against the market or the markets, and they say that the state shouldn't control or regulate the markets. But is that does that correspond to anything real? I mean, don't the markets need the state to function to begin with?
Yeah. Markets, to any substantial extent, cannot exist without the state. For markets to exist in anything more than a rudimentary way, that is, travelers coming across the Silk Road or something like that, you need the state to define property rights and to enforce them. If you're a trader and you want to take your goods from city A to city B, and there's no state to protect your ownership of your goods, then bandits can interrupt, and they did, and steal your cargo. And of course, this is most striking, and everybody knows it best on the open seas with pirates, right? Where there's no state to enforce property rights. And of course, piracy has existed as long as trade has occurred on the open seas. And in fact, it still exists, although it's very limited today. Off of Somalia, I think, at the moment. So in any event, it takes the state for markets to substantially exist, because only the state can define and enforce property rights. So what happens in Europe? As the state rises, gains more power, that is centralized authority, gains more power over all the lords and all the principalities, that it brings a power unto itself, and it does so as population density increases, as its ability to form armies increases, as technology gives it ever greater destructive power. Oh, let me just mention an example, and that is the cannon, gunpowder. Gunpowder enables the blowing away of the defenses of the medieval era, that is, the castle walls. The fortifications could endure for centuries, and they did, but not to cannon power. Constantinople was a magnificently walled city that had lasted for 1,000 years. But the cannon blew those walls away as the Turks began their assault, and in a very short order, Constantinople, its walls blown away, was conquered by the Turks, and we got Istanbul, Turkish as opposed to Christian rule. This is what happens in Western Europe. New technology plays a role in the centralization of the state. But the states are ever threatened by their neighbors in Europe. They can't conquer them, so they can't stop the threat. Because once again, to reiterate, the natural borders provide protection, which keeps conquest of neighbors, or greatly reduces the chance of victory over full victory and subjugation of your neighbors. But because they're always at war, states are always short of revenue. They need money. And one of the ways they can get money, and the reason why they tolerate the rise of the bourgeoisie, is that market activities are taxable. And they can sell monopoly powers to manufacturers and traders, and in doing so, gather revenues which can help them survive. Now, they can also gather revenues and increase the power of the state if they can export more than they import. That is, maintain a positive balance of trade. And that is mercantilism. And the first secular body of political economy is mercantilism. And mercantilism essentially is the economics that legitimates the rising power of the nation state and the practices that make that state yet more powerful. So markets are controlled under mercantilism. It's believed that by controlling them, taxing them, that is creating monopolies and even precluding free trade between zones for sources of revenues in tariffs between the zones, etc., that the state can gain more power. By the time we get to the 18th century, that government intervention was becoming a brake on economic dynamism. And it took thinkers like the wonderful Adam Smith to formulate a full understanding of why you must let markets be free, and that the freedom of markets would bring about dramatically greater productivity, greater wealth for a nation. That is, the title of his book is The Wealth of a Nation. And the magic of the market he captured in his famous expression: everybody follows their own self-interest, either for greater profits as a manufacturer or a trader, or for the most utility, the most pleasure, whatever, for the consumer, and everybody following his or her own selfish interest. brings about the best for society, as if guided by an invisible hand. That's the metaphor, of course, the powerful metaphor legitimating free markets. Of course, by now, private property rights are fairly well, by this time that Smith is writing, property rights have come to be better and better defined and enforced.
Now, heading to the 19th century, how did workers formally gain political power and what effects did that have? And a related question, where does the idea of equality stem from?
Oh, two separate questions, but related questions. The idea of equality is a very exciting project for exploration because it has so many sources in the West. But let's start in Rome. Christianity was nourished amongst the poor workers living in Rome. Those poor workers were often former slaves that through manumission had gained their freedom and become citizens. But they came from all over. They came from different ethnic origins, and they often spoke different languages. Christianity sets forth the postulate of universal humanity. All are equal in the eyes of God. That is, the one God is everybody's God. It's not like God has a chosen people. It's not like a tribal religion. This is a universal religion. So it says all are equal in the eyes of God. And of course, that draws all of these varied ethnic peoples, racially different people, together as Christians. So that the idea of equality is planted firmly right there. But it's a religious equality. It's not a secular equality, but it's planted. And then markets arise, as we've discussed, and markets have a latent idea of equality in the market itself. Think about this. You go to the market, and you've got two traders. One is elite, wealthy, high status, born to high status maybe, but trading all the same. And the other is poor. They trade. And when they trade, they are equal in the following important sense. They both have to say yes, or the trade doesn't happen. They both can say no. So in spite of their social disparity in status, they are fundamentally equal. That's what the market does. And then the market inculcates the concept of equality in another way. And that is, in a market, equivalent is exchanged for equivalent. Two things that are judged by the participants, the traders, to be of equal value are exchanged. So once again, equality. And then Protestantism. Everyone stands alone beneath the judgmental eyes of a harsh God. It accentuates their aloneness, their individualness, and they are equal, as they are in Catholicism too, but now accentuatedly so before their God. And then as markets expand ever more, and they come to mediate ever more human interaction in society, that is, we deal with other people increasingly not according to what tradition says we should do, but we increasingly through markets. That is, through the making of contracts. Every time an agreement is reached in a market, that's contract. We have contracted on these terms. We exchange. As contracts define ever more human interaction, the idea arises with Thomas Hobbes that society itself is nothing but a social contract. The idea that equals use their rational self-interest, their reason, to give up a part of their own sovereignty, some of their rights, to a state for their mutual benefit, to protect us against foreign threats, to protect us against each other, to enforce property rights, etc., etc. But look what the state has become. Nothing but a social contract amongst equals. The traditional view of the state was from the top. That is, its legitimacy came from religion, a divine right to rule. Or in some societies, maybe the rulers themselves are gods. So essentially, but it came from above, from religion. That was the ideology that gave the rulers their power. Now it comes from beneath, from the poorest as well as the wealthy. Everyone is equal. All of these ideas feed into the growth of an idea that humans are everywhere equal. So we get to Thomas Hume and Adam Smith, and they explicitly state that. And then we get it in movements like the French Revolution, which proclaims the equality, the natural equality of all humans. The American Declaration of Independence, which says all men are created equal. So slowly, thanks to capitalism, capitalist institution of markets, and maybe to Christianity and Protestantism, there is born an idea of universal equality. Now the game is, how do you get from the idea to the reality? And of course, no one with special powers, no elites, are going to want to see social equality in the fullest sense, that is, equality of ownership of the means of production. Now to your question. I'm sorry for the length of this very long answer, but it's necessary background, I think, to your question. What happens in the 19th century is industrialization. Industrialization begins in the 18th century, but it doesn't really take off until we get into the 19th century. And what industrialization does is that it proletarianizes labor. That is, labor is reduced to this abysmally low status, which is the worst status short of slavery that exists since the rise of the state, because you no longer have a right to the land, to be on the land. You no longer live in a community that gives you some security. You no longer have a belongingness. Now you stand alone without any ownership of the tools and resources with which you work. And if you want to survive, you've got to find some owner of the means of production, productive wealth, that will hire you as a wage worker. But with industrialization, urbanization occurs. That is, factories are more efficient together when they're located close to each other, and in which they get a pool of wage workers within slums. This gives workers the chance to talk to each other. In the factories, they see that it's their work that's producing the output, but the owner's getting all the profit, and they're living in misery, in dirty slums with barely enough to eat, with prostitution and crime, and they can organize. You see, in pre-urban societies, the workers, peasants, serfs, were spread over the countryside. It was difficult for them to speak with each other, to join together with each other in protest. They did. There were peasant revolts, but they were easily put down, brutally put down, and they never succeeded in improving the lot of the people. But now, with capitalism in its advanced industrial state, workers are brought together where they can organize, come to understand their mutual interest, and threaten the bourgeoisie state with violence. And this is precisely what they do. They revolt. They're insurrections. And they demand better working conditions, higher wages. They demand the abolition of child labor, dirty factories, better sanitation, and most importantly, the right to vote. And the elite, they control politics, yield to these demands out of fear that if they don't do so, that their power and privilege will be ripped away from them in revolution. So that is the great breakthrough in the second half of the 19th century. Now, with the right to vote, for males, of course, only, male voters are the majority of voters, and they can change the rules of the game. They can rewrite what is fair. They can totally redo society to make it more equal, or make it perfectly equal, whatever they want to do. They have the political power to peacefully, democratically do this. They don't. Their condition improves remarkably, but inequality continues to increase. It continues to increase, but because the ideology of the rich continues to be persuasive enough to an adequate percent of the electorate that the electorate doesn't use its political power to bring about greater equality. That will only happen in the wake of the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Yeah, and let's talk about that now. So in the late 1920s, early 1930s, the Great Depression happens, and then following that, from the 1930s up to the 1970s, we have a politically driven decline in inequality. So how that happened?
Okay. It's because finally a crisis severe enough to delegitimate the elite's ideology, at least partially, comes forth. The Great Depression was things equally bad had occurred in the past, but never had capitalism suffered one as brutal, as harsh, when the workers could be organized. And they were capable of organization now due to the forces we said before, industrialization and urbanization. So essentially, laissez-faire ideology, that is, the government should leave the economy alone, was no longer convincing when the economy was tanking, when unemployment went to 25% or even higher, when the banks all went bankrupt and everybody lost their savings. No longer was that ideology adequately convincing to enough of the electorate. So what they did is they expressed their political power in electing politicians that would change the rules of the game. And of course, the leader of this was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who instituted massive amounts of change. And we can't do the whole wonderful menu of things that happened, but let's just mention some of the basic ones. Social Security. People would no longer have to live in misery in old age. The government would ensure some level, some floor to their livelihoods. Worker rights to organize and bargain with their employers. Minimum wage legislation. And then later on, massive spending on public goods, public parks, where everybody could have equal free access, and most importantly, on education. education was dramatically democratized. And this shows up in higher education. I came about and matured, up to the extent I ever matured, in the latter part of this period in which essentially I got an education at a public university where the tuition was so low that I could earn all I needed to pay the tuition in a summer job and have money left over for living expenses and to participate in a social life. Well, that is how much public goods for the general population had been democratized by the time I came of age. And now, of course, just to put that in perspective, you know what is happening in the United States in particular in terms of tuition. Now our poor young people wind up deeply in debt because they can't afford the educations, even at public institutions. So that, and then let's add some other things that happen, such as, well, Lyndon Johnson declares a war on poverty. It fails because of Vietnam, but still, it went that far. We're going to eliminate poverty forever from our society. You got all kinds of workplace protection legislation passed. You've got environmental protection passed. By the way, that was under the rule of a Republican president, Richard Nixon. But Nixon was more of a Democrat than later Democratic presidents, such as Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama. That is where the political center was at the time. That is, in passing legislation, rewriting the rules of the game more in favor of the broad population. Inequality decreases. It's the only time I've been able to find in human history where through peaceful political activity, inequality has declined. But that very experience, that it can happen peacefully and democratically, provides some grounds for at least a little degree of hope that inequality, greater inequality, might be possible.
And what were the changes brought about during the 1970s, political and economic, that we're still living through nowadays?
Yeah. The 1970s were tragic for all of those that wished for a more equal society. It was a crashing blow to the expectations. In 1955, a famous American economist by the name of Simon Kuznets created this conjecture in his presidential address to the American Economic Association. He argued that in the early stages of economic development, inequality increases, but that beyond some point, inequality then decreases. So we can all expect to live in a more equal society in the future. Now, note, that's 1955, sort of the midpoint between the 1930s and the 1970s. His prestige and the data he presented were persuasive, and everybody waxed optimistic. And then the 70s happened. And what happens in the 70s is a great number of things that delegitimate the doctrines that had undergirded the liberal movement that were bringing about a better, fairer life for the masses of populations. And the first thing I'll mention is stagflation, the simultaneous occurrence of high unemployment and high inflation, partially as a result of the war in Vietnam, where taxes were not raised to cover the expenses, so you got inflationary pressures. And then, of course, you got two exogenous shocks. The oil embargo of 1973, which sent energy prices through the roof, and then you had a food output shortage that dramatically raised food prices, and you also had labor that was getting increases in wages, so you got a wage price spiral that created massive amounts of unemployment and inflation simultaneously. So the Keynesian remedy no longer worked. Government intervention, as outlined by Keynes, no longer could be adequately responsible for the twin devils of high inflation and high unemployment. Keynesian economics can fight one or the other, but it's incompatible as a weapon to fight both. So government intervention is delegitimated there. And then we lost the war. I'm speaking of the United States now. And then the United States lost its war in Vietnam, the first war that the U.S. ever lost, and lost to a relatively backward, weak military in a foreign nation. And then there were all of these worker strikes, and there was a countercultural movement of hippies that were smoking dope, and women were going braless, and it seemed that traditional morality was eroding, and that, like some, such as Toynbee had said, the Roman Empire decayed because of moral corruption. Increasing conservatives were arguing that the U.S. empire was falling because of moral corruption, and we elected a president, Ronald Reagan, that campaigned on the argument that government is not the solution, government is the problem. Now, let me put that in perspective. Throughout all of history, since the rise of the state, government has been the enemy of the working class, of workers. Enemy has been or government has been the instrument of the elite to ensure protection of their property against the masses and ensure that they can maintain their privileges. That's all of history until we get to the late 19th century, as we just surveyed. At the end of the 19th century, when workers get the vote, now the state government can be the enemy, because it can pass all of these laws in rewriting the rules of the game that take power, wealth, and privilege away from the elite and spread it out amongst the population. Precisely what happened between the 1930s and the 1970s. The ideological coup was that Reagan, given this background that we've just mentioned, could make a persuasive case that government is a problem. So, cut the size of government. Eliminate the government's intervention in supporting the broad population, although that wasn't said in those terms. Deregulation. Increasing definition of property rights that weren't defined as finely as before, especially in intellectual property rights. And increasingly, the rules of the game were changed such that inequality takes off again and, in fact, exploded. So over the past 45 years, it's done nothing but that, ever increase. And I wish to put that in perspective, too, in the following terms. Between the 1970s and today, it didn't matter which political party in the United States controlled the presidency or Congress. In every single administration, Democratic or Republican, inequality continued to increase. So the Democratic Party, which had traditionally represented the workers, stopped doing so, at least to the same degree, at least to the degree necessary that inequality wouldn't continue to increase. And the real kicker on all of this is the election of Obama. When behind extraordinary hope that in this crisis of 2008, Obama would rise to the stature of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and create a fairer society. He had a crisis which would legitimate doing so, just as Roosevelt had a crisis which legitimated his doing so or leading the effort to do so. A cover picture on Time magazine was of Obama as the next FDR. But what did Obama do on coming to power? He bailed out Wall Street, bailed out the big banks, let unemployment soar, and all of the poor people that had mortgages, who lost their jobs, or the mortgages had been fraudulently given to them, they lost their homes. The Democratic Party revealed itself as no longer in the interest of the people, the broad people. They had sold out to Wall Street and belonged to Wall Street just as the Republican Party did. Masses of people that voted for Obama voted for Trump. That's how we got Trump.
How do you look at the future of inequality?
Well, I look with considerable hope that inequality will not destroy civilization. It's assaulting democracy around the world. Democracy is in, as someone put it, recession. Democracy is declining. And let's note something that isn't adequately punctuated in the discourse about democracy. Democracy isn't a country's democratic or it's not democratic. No, democracy is a spectrum from absolutely zero to 100% or totally democratic. Now, neither extreme exists. There's always some degree of democracy, and it's where on that spectrum from completely democratic to completely undemocratic that every society falls. And all societies are moving along that society. I'm not quite sure it's all societies, but most societies in the world today are moving along that spectrum towards less democracy. You see, as inequality increases, the elite become increasingly worried that democracy will put in political power those that will take away their wealth, vote away their wealth democratically. So they have every interest to suppress democracy. And that's precisely what is happening, rigorously in the United States with voter registration movements, with challenging elections, legitimacy, etc., etc. Well, if we lose democracy, we lose a lot, and I'm not sure we'll ever recover it again, at least certainly not peacefully. It will take revolution. And revolution, and given the state of weaponry today, is a frightening thought in terms of the massive damage done, if not total damage done to humanity. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic? I would say that there are good grounds for being pessimistic. After all, since the rise of the state, extreme inequality has existed, except for that little period of declining inequality, a very short period of 40 years, between the 1930s and 1970s. And that is reversed by an ideological coup. If it's that easy to end the progress towards greater equality, if it could happen that quickly, that facilely, then is there a chance for greater equality in the future? That's the negative scenario. But let me say a few things in favor of optimism. I realize that I want greater equality, so I have a maybe biased towards optimism, and everyone should be suspicious of me for that, for what I say, because of my bias towards greater equality. The possibility of greater equality, secular equality, is new. It only dates back about 300 years. The idea didn't exist before. Everything was taken as naturally unequal, and the idea that the inequality could be reduced didn't float around. The idea, and we gave a little sketch of the rise of the idea of inequality, it's very new in human history and has only been accentuated in the past couple hundred years. At the time of Jefferson and the French Revolution and all of that. And so that's a very short period of time. Also, reason has been given far more importance as the instrument which we should use to determine how we live. Reason is also new as the principal tool for the guidance of life. Before, you were to give your allegiance to faith, not reason. Reason only goes back a few centuries. It's first Descartes, René Descartes, that gives it priority. That is, we should doubt everything. And then the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, spilling over into the Scottish Enlightenment and over the Rhine into the German Enlightenment, then raise reason, the power of reason, ever higher to that which we should trust in our decision making. We should submit everything to the rule of reason, to the razor edges of reason, to make good decisions. And with education, the expanding democratization of education, more and more people are brought to realize that it isn't faith, but it's reason that we should utilize to make our world a happier, better place for ourselves and everyone else. And then to top this off, my optimism off, my guarded optimism off. In the past, well, let me just leaf through something here to touch upon the statistics, but I don't trust my mind to hold on to them. Slavery has become illegal in every country in the world. That's very recent. As recently as 50 years ago, slavery was still legal in some countries. That's extraordinary. Slavery has existed since the rise of the state, and even earlier in some of those riverine, rich, sedentary hunter-gatherer societies. Polygamy and harems have pretty much died out. Polygamy still exists, but it exists in a very limited way, mostly in Islamic societies. And harems, I don't hear of any existing anymore whatsoever. Monogamy has conquered public belief, and people believe that it should be one woman, one man, that this is the way humans should live together. Note the equality of this. One woman, one man. By the way, if I might mention, this comes about, again, thanks to the rise of capitalism, because in capitalism with nation-state competition, nations that outlaw polygamy and enforce monogamy, which was also a Christian legacy, they invest more in their children's education. They invest more in the creation of human capital, human productive skills. They become more economically powerful and able to outcompete their polygamous neighbors. So it's essentially this group competition or nation-state competition that brings us this monogamy. Between 1990 and 2017, that's only 27 years, infant mortality worldwide has been halved, cut in half. How extraordinary in just 27 years. Over the past 60 years, life expectancy worldwide has increased from 52 years to 73 years. Extraordinary. 21 additional years of life in just 60 years. Over the same period, 60 years, global literacy has doubled from 42% to 86%. Now, this extraordinary progress, in spite of rising inequality, there's no guarantee it'll continue. In fact, with rising inequality, it could snuff it out. It could reverse it. We could return to a world in which there's no longer economic growth, in which there's a small elite that owns all productive property and everybody else lives at subsistence, just as throughout almost all of civilized history since 5,500 years ago. There's no guarantee that the future will bring us progress in terms of inequality. And then in terms of the threat of inequality, I want to make mention of three horrors, potentially. Mm-hmm. We could call them three Frankensteinian monsters, because all three are consequent to our extraordinary success as a species. The first is nuclear Armageddon. That is, we unleash a nuclear war, which creates a nuclear winter in which our species can't survive. That has been hypothesized as a possibility now for a good number of years. And we continue. The spread of atomic weapons continues. And although there's been some arms reduction, it now seems that there's a reversal in that too, as the armaments war is going hot again, especially in terms of ways of delivering these warheads. So that's one monster we created because we're so scientifically clever that we can master control of the atom. Second, ecological devastation. Ecological devastation is racing at a speed which is surpassing our worst expectations, and our international efforts to try to come to some agreement, coordination, to stop this are not yielding fruits. The devastation continues racing ahead. And of course, we read in the newspaper the consequences of this every day. Again, this is a consequence of our extraordinary success as a species. Our population has exploded. That's the gauge of the success of a species. If its population is increasing, it's successful. If it's declining, it's unsuccessful. Well, ours has exploded, especially over the past couple of centuries. And with that, our knowledge of how to manipulate the world has also exploded, enabling us to increase our technological command over nature, our output of goods and services, and population combined with more consumption, use of resources by every human being is an ecological catastrophe, unless it can be reversed or controlled. And the third Frankensteinian monster, but a Frankenstein monster is something we create that then acts back to our detriment or destroys us. The third possible, and it's only a possible Frankensteinian monster, is robotization. And that is that we're so clever that we'll create robots that are more intelligent than we are, And that once they have intelligence and can communicate amongst themselves and think about thinking and their own best interest, will find no use for their creators and eliminate us. Now, that is really science fiction, but serious scientists such as Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, thought this a real threat to us in the future. But for now, that remains highly conjectural. Well, the end of humanity from any of these three forces remains conjectural. But the underlying important point that I want to end that with is that dealing with these three threats is made increasingly difficult by inequality and rising inequality. They handicap our ability to deal with these threats.
Just one last question then. So looking at the present state of inequality across the globe, what would you say you think would be the best solutions for it?
Well, I think what we need is a new vision of what the future could be. But we had two competing visions up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was socialism and capitalism. When the Eastern the state socialist societies collapsed in 1991 and before 1991, it seemed that there was only one possible society left that is viable, and that is capitalism. As a matter of fact, a famous book by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, laid that out. It's all over, folks. History is over. Capitalism is our future. Well, all other possible alternatives then sort of fell out of the discourse. And every attention then is making minor changes in capitalism and, tweaking it here and there so everything's a little bit better, but there's no alternative vision. My alternative vision, if I can be permitted to express it, is that there are two measures that could ground a new vision that are fully compatible with our traditional values of today, that are still our values today, such as freedom, self-determination, private property, and markets. All of these things can be preserved and actually enhanced if we did two things. One is guarantee employment to everyone capable of work. This would immediately eliminate unemployment and poverty, so that two sources of crime, major sources of crime, would instantaneously disappear. There would be no more welfare for able-bodied workers. If you're able to work and don't accept the work available that is guaranteed by the government as employer of the last resort, you get no welfare. That's it. We all work. And this has to be combined with retraining so that as people lose their jobs because of the increasing pace of technological change, this is inevitable. That is, the training you get as a young person is no longer adequate for your full lifetime, as it was in previous generations. Now, the skills you learn are going to be outdated, and you need to renew them. We need some institutional way so that people in their 30s and 40s and 50s, or even 60s, can learn the skills, knowledge that is necessary to be productive members of society. Guaranteed employment would give everyone the social respect and the self-respect of being productive members of society, contributing to society's welfare. The other measure, and this could be instituted almost overnight. As a matter of fact, during World War II, that's what de facto we got. Not de jure, but de facto. When we mobilized for war, we got everybody working, and even people that weren't working before, like housewives and everything else. Everybody else was drawn into the workforce. and the workforce dramatically expanded. But that wasn't intentionally creating guaranteed employment. Although I should add that Franklin Delano Roosevelt advocated guaranteed employment and wanted it to be part of the Social Security Act. It was also supposed to be part of the Full Employment Act of 1946. In both cases, it was cut out. And the last time it was intended public policy was 1978 in the United States in the Humphrey Hawkins bill that also was going to guarantee employment. So it's not like it's new to the American public discourse. It's just that it hasn't been put out front very much in recent times, although Bernie Sanders and some others have been forwarding the idea. The second major reform is workplace democracy. And this would take a longer time to implement. It's where workers increasingly democratically control the firms in which they work. It's taking the freedom and democracy in the political sphere and taking it to the everyday world of work. Just as we elect our politicians, we would elect our managers, the ones that direct how the firm carries out its functions. We would have periodic elections, just as we do in politics, and if they weren't doing their jobs well, we wouldn't re-elect them. If we were making a mess out of it, we would impeach them. But the workers would determine who runs the firm and broadly how it's run. That is the rules of the game. And whether the ownership belongs to the workers, which is a possibility, or it's held in trust, is an open possibility. But it would, both of these reforms leave the two major institutions of capitalism, which are private property and markets, in place. It's just that private property is now more democratized. It belongs more to the workers. And there are all sorts of schemes in which this transition could come peacefully forth, but it should increase economic dynamism because it would empower everyone with an interest in everybody else's greater education within your firm so that they will contribute more to the firm's output. So that essentially it should lead to a more dynamic economy. Although in saying that, I'm not saying we should have more economic growth for its own sake. I don't think that. I think economic growth has been a necessary goal, and we've done really well at it. We have economies, the privileged, the elite rich economies today that can provide a very good standard of living, a luxurious standard of living for all of its populations. It's just not distributed such that is the case. We don't need to produce more materially. We'll produce more because technological advance will permit us to discover new things. But if we don't have growth as our objective, we can produce things that no longer devastate the environment. And they will simply improve the quality of our lives. This retraining which comes with guaranteed employment is an instrument for furthering this. My hope is that if these two reforms, it's still capitalism, by the way, it's just ownership is different. It's major institutions of private property and markets, which I think are absolutely essential for economic dynamism and human freedom, political freedom. These are preserved. So all we do is crush inequality, reduce it. I'm not saying get rid of it. I'm not saying it should be pure egalitarianism. We should have the amount of inequality which best enables us to attain the social goals that we think are the best goals we can have as a collectivity together. No more inequality than that, no less than that. And that's what we should work towards a definition of.
Great. So the book is again The Origins and Dynamics of Inequality, Sex, Politics, and Ideology. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of this interview. Dr. Wisman, just before we go, would you like to tell people, apart from the book, where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, there's a site which is at American University in the economics department, where a bit of my work is described, as well as my curriculum vitae, which lists all of the publications I have authored over my very long career. There's also something called ResearchGate, which if you join, it's free. If you join, has many of my publications. And I think that's probably enough source for finding out more about my thoughts. I've written about a great number of things, including the things I've discussed here, that are in, some of which are in the book and others not. And in particular, I've elaborated on how inequality leads to macroeconomic instability, financial crises, and things of that sort. And I've written about economic inequality and ecological devastation, and lots of other things along these lines.
Okay,
I
so
invite, I invite readers and I invite your critical reactions to these. I want to continue learning, and I learn in part by having my faults pointed out to me.
very well. Dr. Wisman, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show and thank you for writing the book. It was a great read. So it's been an honor to everyone.
The honor is mine, Ricardo. Thanks for much for inviting me to share what my book is all about and some of my other thoughts. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this episode until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there, starting at $1 per month. You also have links to PayPal. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga, Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf, Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whitting, Bernard Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, O'Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguenzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Uniga, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Weira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yassila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litska, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, and Sonny Smith. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanag, Dam Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivat. Thank you for all.